Now, it's almost a little crazy to think that House of the Dragon and The Rings of Power, two of the biggest shows of all time in terms of budget, scope, and anticipation, or maybe dread for some, would both come out at virtually the same time and, in a sense, compete against each other, especially when you consider just how similar they are. That they are both of the fantasy genre and feature a huge cast of characters across a sweeping story set in a lore-rich world that originated in beloved and popular books, and that both are basically prequels to, in one case, two trilogies of films, and in the other case, one of the most watched shows of all time. And of course, when I say they're competing against each other, I don't mean to imply people can or will only watch one or the other. Certainly many people will watch both, including perhaps you watching this video now. Instead, what I mean is with both of them coming out at the same time, it's easier to sort of compare and contrast them, to spot what one show might be doing or getting right that the other one isn't so much. And so far, and granted it's only been a few episodes for both, but the biggest, most glaring difference between the two shows, in my opinion, has been how well the characters have or haven't been handled or used. And though I know it goes without saying, but getting your characters right, making them feel real and believable, and getting your viewers to love or hate them, or to love to hate them, is one of, if not the most important things virtually any story must do. But this is something that you could argue is even more important in the fantasy genre, because your characters have the double duty of having to sell your world, make it feel believable, like a real place that they inhabit. In fact, usually if they, the characters, feel genuine and like actual, relatable people on some level, if their motivations are understood and cared about, if you, the viewer, want to see them do anything from just survive to maybe succeed or maybe even be stopped, well then, almost without even realizing it, you'll likely start to believe in and care about the world itself, no matter how strange or different from our own world it might be. Basically, multi-dimensional characters lead to a world that feels the same, that has depth. And I'm going to care about what happens to it because I like and care about the characters who inhabit that world. Simply put, I'm not going to care just because you told me there's some sort of great danger or threat out there to this world, no matter how cool your world may appear at first glance, or how great your initial idea might be. Which, no, doesn't mean you can't start a fantasy story out with an epic prologue telling me about that looming threat, like the Lord of the Rings films did. Or that you can't start it out with maybe a hint at some shadowy threat in the background, like Game of Thrones did with the White Walkers at the start of the first episode. You can absolutely set the stage and introduce the world in a grandiose or even subtle way. But if I don't very quickly understand and care about, say, Gandalf and the Hobbits in The Lord of the Rings, or about the Stark family in Game of Thrones and everyone else we soon meet, then I'm not going to care about some great evil coming to destroy their world. And so far, one of the problems with Rings of Power is, well, I don't care so much about that looming threat, which is the seemingly imminent return of Sauron. And there's a sort of twofold reason for this. One is that, well, flat out we know how the story of Sauron eventually will end. Most of us have seen or read The Lord of the Rings, which, and this is a problem all prequels will face, it puts an even greater burden on the characters to be enjoyable enough to hold my interest, since we already know where a lot of them are going to end up. We know from the very start that there is a fixed point all of these events have to eventually lead up to. And so, and this is the second point, if I don't care about the journey to get to that known endpoint, if I don't get invested in the stories of the individual characters despite knowing many of their outcomes, then why watch? This is then one of the reasons why Galadriel feels so different from the one we'll see many thousands of years later in story in The Lord of the Rings. It's done to make it feel like there's a long, long journey of incredible events and growth before her that we're now going to get to see. We're supposed to be wondering right now, my goodness, what happens to eventually turn her into the Galadriel we'll see and know from the movies. Instead, she's such a departure from that character and so one-dimensional, we're left wondering, why is she so angry and bitchy all the time? And it's like the show's writers even realize they may have gone too far with her when they give us this scene in the most recent episode where she's riding a horse in slow motion and she's all smiles. It's like an attempt to remind us she is capable of other emotions because we haven't seen them. And this is who she would be free from the burden of Sauron. This is why we should care for her. This is why we should root for her. So she can become the Galadriel we love. But of course, caring about characters isn't that simple, and she's not the only one-dimensional character we have in the show. Pretty much all of them can be summed up easily in a word or two. I mean, we have Arondir, who is very stoic, we have Halbrand, who is mysterious and mischievous, Nori, who is kind and curious, and so on. And as for what motivates these characters, what are they after? Well, beyond Galadriel and her Sauron obsession, I'm not entirely sure with most of them. Whereas if I had to pick a single word to describe characters in House of the Dragon, it'd be much more difficult, though I could pick one word to describe almost all of them, and that word is complicated, because most of them have a lot going on, and no single word could ever hope to sum it up. Though at the same time, most of their motives can be deciphered easily enough. We know what most of them are after. Daemon Targaryen, for example, is not a character that a single word could describe, unless again we use the word complicated. And that's because his actions are oftentimes very unpredictable, and not because the writers have been inconsistent with him, but because there is a lot going on with him internally and externally that we've already been shown in the first couple episodes. And from all this, by and large, we know his motivations. We know he wants to be king. He wants to sit on the Iron Throne. Yet he still has a love for his family, mainly Rhaenyra, who is actually a rival for that throne he so desperately wants, and who has her own set of problems regarding one day possibly being queen. And since these complicated characters are interesting and likable, since their interactions are intriguing, I want to see and know more about them, how their story will unfold, and I want to know what exactly will become of Westeros in this time period, despite already knowing what kind of has to happen to align with what we'll see a couple hundred years later in Game of Thrones. And going along with this, with caring about and understanding the motives of the characters leading to care about the world and what happens to it, and thus enjoyment of the story itself, which is the ultimate goal, the characters have to feel like they have agency, like their actions have an actual impact on the world, big or small, and have consequences or lead to reactions from other characters. We have to have cause and effect. This is something Game of Thrones initially did perhaps better than any other show I'd ever seen before, at least on such a large scale, and something that House of the Dragon, dare I say, is doing pretty well at itself. There was, and is in the new series, this interplay between the characters that feels so very real and authentic. Like, this is not a story being crafted by writers, but is instead a captured slice of an actual other world that we're seeing, where the characters themselves are, as odd as it may sound, completely independent of any type of overarching plot or story that's leading them to an eventual final resolution, which isn't to say there is no plot, only that the characters don't feel like they exist and are enslaved by that plot, that the story is truly created by them and their actions, that everything can change in a single moment because of them, not because of a decision made by a writer to get them to a predetermined endpoint. And this was essentially the major problem with the final couple seasons of Game of Thrones, especially the very last one. Because, in a way, part of the point of that show, part of what made it so damn interesting, was that there was never going to be an end to the game that is played over who sits on the Iron Throne. It can never be won, not for too long anyway, which is why the White Walkers are needed, to be able to introduce something that can be a sort of end point, or a place for them to say, this is the end of this part of the story. But of course, the Game of Thrones itself will go on. Problem is, to get to this one singular endpoint when you've had so many characters and so many smaller stories along the way, and to now allow virtually every character to play a role of some kind in this ending, things suddenly started to feel very, very contrived in a show where once upon a time, things had only very rarely felt contrived, if at all, where it felt like, as I was saying before, that the characters truly did have agency over their lives and were creating the plot. Rings of Power, however, has started out already feeling very contrived, like we're watching a game where the pieces are being moved from one spot to the next in order to tell the story they've already decided. The characters don't feel like they have agency as much as they feel like a piece of a puzzle that is slowly being revealed and completed. And don't get me wrong, not everything can be or should be Game of Thrones. It's not a complete failure if your story feels somewhat contrived and the audience can see the hand moving the pieces around the board from time to time. Because the truth is, everything in a fictional story is contrived. Everything from the smallest character decision to the biggest world-shattering event was decided upon by a writer, which means, as a writer, if you want your story to feel like the characters have agency, like they're actually making the decisions and causing the story to happen, You have to put yourself inside their mind the best you can, and in a sense, allow them to guide the story. As a writer, you almost have to play chess against yourself at times, allowing the characters to be as wise and cunning or as dumb and clueless as they actually are. You don't want it to feel like one wins or loses because that's what you, the writer, decided for the story, but because that is the natural result based on the strengths and or weaknesses of the characters themselves. And this, I'd argue, is the hardest part of storytelling, because you of course don't always or even usually want your story to end based entirely on which character is truly the smarter or stronger one, because that's generally the villains, or should be. You of course want your protagonist to have difficult obstacles and enemies to overcome. You want them to grow and learn how to stop something that is beyond them at the start of the story. But you want their eventual victory to still be an impressive feat in the end. Like, it could have easily gone the other way, but our hero had one trick up their sleeves that saved the day, or their perseverance and or belief in themselves or their cause, something intangible like that, was the difference maker. And so personally here, and mind you, this comes from someone who isn't formally educated on how to write, and someone who played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons as a dungeon master in their life, and has always wanted my players to feel like they have full control, that there is no set story or set quest or adventure for them, only what they make of it. Anyway, I've always thought the goal of any writer or storyteller who truly wants to sell an audience on their story to make the characters and maybe the world feel as real as possible should be to remove yourself and your ego as best you can from your story, to try to erase any and all traces of your meddling from it, to make it feel as organic as possible, as character-driven as possible, not coming from and being generated by someone's imagination. And I feel this should especially be the case when working in a fictional world already long since created and established by another, like in the case of Middle-earth created by J.R.R. Tolkien, that you need to check your ego at the door and do all you can to make it feel like it's coming from the original creator that many are already very familiar with. Even though, yeah, it's virtually impossible to duplicate what Tolkien did. I mean, if it wasn't, everyone would create their own amazing fictional worlds, right? But anyway, this is one of the biggest differences between these two new shows. House of the Dragon, though, yeah, maybe a bit heavy-handed with their messaging at times, certainly more so than we saw out of Game of Thrones, while it still feels much like the original. It still fits into that same world like a hand into a glove. And sure, that's probably in large part because George R.R. Martin, the creator of all of this, is involved. Either way, even with some of the messaging, it feels like the main goal or intent was to make this fit as neatly and as snugly into the world we already know from the previous series as possible, and it does it quite well. It gives that same vibe that the early seasons of Game of Thrones did. Not perfectly, but not too bad so far. This is not the case with Rings of Power. It doesn't seem to fit with the actual works of Tolkien, nor the movies created by Peter Jackson 2 decades ago, though it very much uses the veneer of both. It very much wants you to think that the intent is to, in a sense, honor both of those works. Problem is, not only can we see through it, but the showrunners, actors, and so on have also flat out told us that this is not the intent, that they want to bring Tolkien to the modern audience by changing things, which pretty much goes against everything I've been talking about here. That when you go in with a clear intent, when you try too hard to do something with your characters, beyond letting them be characters, that intent and meddling is oftentimes going to be very glaring, especially in something as known and beloved as Tolkien's work. Which isn't to say you can't or shouldn't ever include political messages in shows, or that they'll automatically be bad because the creator wants to make a point of some kind. These are not mutually exclusive things. A talented writer can absolutely make a statement about something while still allowing the story to feel natural and organic, and still enjoyable. House of the Dragon is indeed a bit of a commentary about misogyny and patriarchal societies, but it very much fits with the source material. The problem is when it doesn't fit so well, when you twist the works of others to fit the message you want to get across, when you play in the sandbox of someone else and reshape that sand within it to fit your own needs, that ends up being quite glaring. So glaring sometimes that it feels like little more than, to be blunt, pissing in someone else's sandbox, then patting yourself on the back for making a lake in it, and then wondering why no one else who cares about that sandbox is happy with your addition. Well, that's all I've got for this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think about any and all of this, or what you've thought about one or both of these shows, assuming you're watching one or both of them. Which one do you prefer over the other, or are they both about the same, or are they both just terrible, or both excellent? Whatever the case may be, leave your comments below and let's talk some Rings and Thrones. And until next time, thanks for watching.